now it's a great pleasure to introduce this excellent scientist woman, my friend, Dr. Sarian Kosten. Sarian is an aquatic ecologist appointed as assistant professor at the Aquatic Ecology and Environment Biology Department at the Institute for Water and Wetland Research at the Humboldt University in 2013. She has a background in aquatic ecology and environmental science. Her research focuses on how global change impacts aquatic systems and how negative effects can be mitigated, and how abiotic and biotic conditions drive aquatic greenhouse gas emissions and affect carbon burial. She enjoys collaborating with researchers worldwide to better quantify greenhouse gas emissions, to understand the biological and physical drivers, and particularly in human-made systems, to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and optimize carbon storage. Combines fieldwork in Europe, South America, and China with experiments at different scales and modeling. She has a master's degree and PhD in environmental science from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. During the PhD, she specialized in the impact of climate on aquatic systems. She used a space-for-time approach based on fieldwork in lakes along the latitudinal gradient between the northeast of Brazil and Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, the famous Salga project. Since then, she has worked on several projects looking at global change impacts on aquatic systems and greenhouse gas emissions. She maintains a wide network with Brazilian researchers and already had the opportunity to come to Natal a few times. One of these opportunities, we did a course together about carbon dynamics in a lake in a semi-arid region here in Rio Grande do Norte state with other scientists and students, giving us exchanges of knowledge resulting in a published paper in Frontiers in Microbiology. So thank you very much to stay here today with us, unfortunately in a remote way. So the word is yours, my friend.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for this very kind introduction. I'm going to see if this works. Do you see my screen now?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me to give this already last plenary talk of the Shallow Lakes Conference. And yeah, as Stephen already said, I have to do it also. I have to repeat my congratulations to the whole organizing group. Yeah, to get together this great event. I really learned a lot, and I also enjoyed it a lot. And of course, during lighter and easier periods, I experience how nice it can be to be physically in Natal, and it's a pity we are not there. But I think well, everybody together did a great job to make the best out of this situation. And I know that less is more, but how could I leave out some of the people that are that contributed to this work? So I would like to thank all co-authors of all the works that I'm going to show you that contributed in one way or another to all the things that I'm going to show here. So my talk is going to be about inland waters, shallow inland waters, and their role as carbon hubs in the landscape. So we have seen these kind of time schedules before. Inland waters were first seen as microcosms, and yeah, I refer them here as tubs. very isolated from the surroundings, really closed systems. And later in our understanding, we understood that inland waters are very important receivers also. They receive a lot of carbon. And the papers shown here, they mostly focus on organic carbon that they receive. But of course, several studies point out that also inorganic carbon is a very important inflow of material into these systems. So we know that DIC coming into lakes, for instance, can be responsible for a high share of the CO2 emissions from these systems, but also that these fossil and inorganic carbonates that come into our lakes can drive inorganic participation to the sediment. So carbon burial, and also fuel a lot of the primary production that is going on. So in my talk, I will not talk too much about these fluxes, but I will touch upon it a little bit later. But I will show some figures and some examples of how important inland waters are for the landscape scale carbon budget, and also would like to start with some introduction on how important inland waters are on a global scale. And inevitably, I will repeat some of the great introductions that were also given in session 7. If you have not yet seen the talks there, I would really invite you to watch these, because there are already very nice studies presented there as well. So what I would like to do, especially for the people that have less background in these greenhouse gas emission types and their emission pathways, I will give a brief introduction about that. And then I will go through different biotic and abiotic drivers of these carbon fluxes. And then I will come back to the importance of these shallow inland waters for the carbon cycle on the landscape scale. And I would like to end with some possible mitigation directions through climate smart water management. So inland waters, they significantly contribute to the global greenhouse gas emission. I just mentioned that. So they emit a lot of methane and CO2, but they can also take up a lot of CO2 through primary production, obviously. So they're really carbon processing hotspots. And because of the often anaerobic sediments, there can be a lot of methane production. And of course, in the water column, in aerobic or anaerobic conditions, there's also a lot of CO2 or respectively methane production. And especially when it comes to methane, these inland waters that we are all studying, they are a very important global source of methane. So when we talk about the importance of inland waters for the global carbon cycle, what you often see is this very clear overview figure of the global methane budget. And here we see wetlands, and here we see other natural emissions, which include lakes. And then we see that if we would combine all these emission factors here, that lakes and other types of inland waters, they are the major contributors of methane to the atmosphere. So what we're talking about is really an important flux. And of course, we know that methane is a very important global greenhouse. So what we should also not forget is that a lot of the methane that is coming from this red arrow, so the anthropogenic arrow, is also coming from wetland ecosystems. And I will talk to you about, I will talk a little bit about these different systems. So of course, rice fields, they are responsible for a very large share of the methane emissions worldwide. So our footprint through our food consumption is very high through this rice consumption. I will not talk about rice during this field. There are a lot of scientists focusing on rice already. So I would like to focus on the other picture that we see here, and that is aquaculture. So the relative contribution of aquaculture to the atmosphere in terms of methane is much less than rice at the moment. But we see a very big increase in aquacultural production, and with it also the rise of methane production to the atmosphere. And as Vanessa just told in the introduction, I started to work more in these natural systems, which is not because I particularly like these kind of systems. The beauty of the natural systems, I personally like much more to work there, but these are the systems that I think we can contribute a lot. So what is the type of work that I, and together with all my collaborators, do a lot? So we measure a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in different ways. Of course, you can use satellites, you can use eddy covariance towers, and we do a little bit of that, but most of our work focuses on measurements of diffuse fluxes using chambers, like we see here in the Pantanal, or also in the Netherlands, where we also have higher chambers, including larger plants as well. We measure in the field, but we also do a lot of work, experimental work, both outside and indoors in the lab in different scales. So as you see here, we also use a lot of funnels, and we do that because when we talk about emission, we have a lot of studies focusing on diffusive emissions, which occur when the concentration of methane or CO2 in the water is higher than in the atmosphere. So then we get a diffusion from the water to the atmosphere. Of course, the vice versa can also occur. And the same goes for N2O, which is an even more powerful greenhouse gas, which I will talk a little bit about in the end. But here I will focus mostly on CO2 and methane. So the diffusive pathway is a very important one, but what we see especially in shallow systems is that there's a lot of methane production in these anaerobic environments in the sediment. And methane does not dissolve so well in water, so it surpasses its solubility concentration quite easily, and then it forms bubbles, and when these bubbles are big enough, or when they grow suddenly because there's a low pressure front passing, then they liberate themselves from the sediment and they rise to the atmosphere. So the people that are working in assessing these greenhouse gas emissions from inland waters, I think there is general consensus that this evolution is very often a very important emission pathway, and we should quantify it really well. So I call this the rise of the bubble. We from measuring diffusive fluxes, we now know that we also have to take care of quantifying this bubble flux very well. And that's not always that straightforward. And to illustrate that, I would like to share a small movie with you that we taped in the Pantanal. It's like a bubble bath that we're going to see here. Oh. I don't think you're seeing it. I should try to move it to this screen. Is it working now?
Yes.
So you see, it's like a bubble bath. See, there were a lot of, we arrived there and there were a lot of bubbles rising to the surface. So we thought, okay, we have to be there. This is really a hot spot. We want to measure this flux. And then you come back and you get your equipment out and you put the funnels there and you measure almost nothing. Because what happens with these bubbles is that they rise to the surface very episodically. So this could be, for example, what I just said, it could be a low pressure front passing and then all the bubbles rise, and then it needs time before the bubbles are built up again through microbial methane production. So you need really long-term measurements to quantify well how much methane is coming, being emitted through bubbles to the atmosphere. So what I would like to do during my talk is show you different impacts, different stressors, and different drivers, all responsible for driving these greenhouse gas emissions from different systems. So I chose not to go into depth on the different drivers, but show you different types of influences. And I mentioned some here in these small balls around the type of systems that I'm working at. And I would like to start with the one of fire. I don't have a lot of data to show you about this one because we just started working on this. But as Luc also already mentioned in his talk, Brazil faced a very immense fire, not only in the Amazon, but particularly this year also in the Pantanal, where 1/3 approximately of the biome burned, which is a size larger than my country. And of course, this has huge impacts on the larger, very illustrative organisms, the jaguar that is living there, but it also has very big impacts on the aquatic ecosystems, which we are just grasping to understand. And personally, I do not feel an innocent bystander. In my country alone, we import a lot of soybean from Brazil. So indirectly, we are definitely also responsible for this devastating effect on these biomes. So also in this respect, I really hope I can contribute something to first understand and hopefully eventually also prevent this kind of disasters. So hopefully in the next conference I can say something more about that. But for now, I will talk a little bit more about the things that we already have data on. And I would like to start with the effects of warming. As has also Steven also mentioned in his previous talk, we know quite a bit about the effects of warming on ecosystems. And well, we have also seen that warming has a very strong effect on methane emissions from aquatic ecosystems. So what we have found, joining all data sets that were available 3 years ago, that both had methane abolition data and were taking over a larger range of temperature. If we plot the temperature against the abolition rates, we see that for each degree of warming, methane abolition is increasing with 6 to 20%. So this is really a lot. And we saw this not only for natural systems outdoors where these things were measured, but we also did experiments at the NEO Institute in Wageningen, where we had really controls. Those are the black and the red dots. So here we could tease out the seasonality effect, which obviously is also depicted on this x-axis. And we could separate or compare year-round emission rates as well. And then we found that this increase in abolition was also found on a yearly basis. So we measured this both indoors in experiments and also outdoors, and everything points at this very strong self-enforcing feedback. So when it's warmer, we find more methane emission, which then of course warms our atmosphere, leading again to more methane emissions. So this is a very strong positive feedback, very negative for us as human beings and for many ecosystems, but it was very apparent from all our studies and from colleagues as well. So another factor that I would like to touch upon is the effect of drought. Here we did also several experiments looking at the effect of drought of littoral areas, and what we find here in very small experiments, having cores that we keep wet, cores of sediments, and cores that we dry out and then we re-wet again. And you really see this. So this is the dry period, or this is the wet period, sorry. And we see here the wet cores, or the sediment that was always wet. And here in black, we have the drying cores. On the onset of drought, we have a very big peak of CO2. And the same happened, I will not bore you with too many graphs, but the same happened for methane. So you see very strong dynamics. And of course, when it becomes very dry, the microbes, they become much less active. And then the emissions even drop below the wet emissions. But particularly here, when oxygen can intrude into the sediment and advance aerobic decomposition, we see a very strong peak. And we believe this is also increased by these cracks that you can see, also enhancing the surface area, the exchange between the sediment and the atmosphere. So again, when we re-wet, we see a peak again, likely due to the fact that then, of course, all these cracks, the CO2 and the methane that is there is flushed out, but also because there is a lot of nutrients and broken down organic matter available then that is easily consumed by all the organisms when the water comes back. So we scaled this up to a Brazilian reservoir-wide estimate, because on one hand it's not so straightforward to quantify these emissions, but on the other hand we also do not have a lot of data on how large the areal extent is of these dry zones. So what we did here is we used the years 2014-2015, which were extremely dry years in many parts of Brazil, and we combined all the water level data from the larger reservoirs that you see on the figure here, and we related this to aerial extents that we could extract from them based on satellite images, and we could then estimate how large the area was of the extra sediment that was exposed to the atmosphere. So this is sediment that is normally not exposed to the atmosphere during the dry season, but this was really due to the extreme drought, and that was also where we collected our sediment cores from this zone that is normally not exposed, but now because of this very low water level it was. So multiplying the flux times the area, we came to an estimated emission of 0.85 teragrams of CO2 equivalents. And this is roughly the same as the emission of a very large reservoir on a yearly basis. So this was in a very short time, you can have a very big emission, which is then equivalent to a single hydropower plant, let's say. While we were doing this, also a very nice global initiative started to look at emissions from dry ecosystems. And here everybody was invited to measure CO2 emissions from their systems, and it was all joined in one big database to come on to arrive to more global conclusions. And this was led by Philip Keller, that you can see here on the picture. So a lot of people participated. Of course, the usual suspected countries maybe were overrepresented. I was very happy that I could take some samples in Brazil, but we joined all these different flux estimates, and we took a lot of additional data from the type of system that we were sampling, and also the type of soil. We did some laboratory analysis, and the overall outcome was that we have a considerable flux from these dry systems that are normally often neglected, because people often focus on either the terrestrial part or on the aquatic part, but we estimate that about 6% of all aquatic emissions comes actually from these dry zones during the time that they're drying and then re-wetting again. So this was a very nice effort with more than 60 colleagues from 17 countries, and we almost had 200 sites included. But the outcome, of course, was not positive again. Again, we are looking at a very strong self-enforcing feedback. More drought will lead to more CO2 emissions, enhancing climate change again. And I have to admit, when we were doing this research, most sites do not look like this. So we went to the field and we were interested in the sediment emissions, but what we mostly found is that the sediments were very quickly colonized by terrestrial plants, which we tried to avoid because we want to standardize everything. So we were only interested in bare soil. But this, of course, then leads to an overestimation of your CO2 flux, because at the same time, the plants are fixing CO2. So this vegetation likely very strongly impacts these dry emissions, but the extent to which this happens is not yet quantified. And that is something we want to tackle in the second round of this global inventory, which is still open for collaboration. And we particularly invite people from the white spots of the globe to participate. We already have a lot of participants from Western Europe, and we also have quite some collaborators in Brazil, but you see there are many places in the world where we would also still like to have data from. So if you have interest in collaboration, please visit this website, and I contributed to the announcement of this very nice project, I think. So this bridge is also to my next topic, which I would like to talk about, and that's the impact of vegetation on, particularly on methane emissions. What I'm showing here is a very nice figure made by Renske Vroom. We are working on a paper led by Pascal Boltman, who you can also see on the picture here. So we're looking at the kind of a hybrid plant here. That is just a schematic representation. You know what I mean, from floating plants, emergent plants, and submerged plants. So we wanted to incorporate all different ways in which different type of plants can impact methane emissions. And I think in total, we ended up identifying something like 20 different ways in which plants impact methane emissions. So it's really rather complex. So what we, for example, see is that when you have emergent plants, they act kind of as chimneys. So they transport methane from the methane-rich sediment to the atmosphere, thereby often, but not always, enhancing methane emissions to the atmosphere, because they're bypassing the oxidation that may happen in the top sediment layer and in the water column. Also, plants, they leak a lot of oxygen, radial oxygen loss, right, in the sediment, thereby impeding methane production or facilitating methane oxidation. So this is also a very important factor of plants, and there are several studies now that suggest that submerged plants in this way really reduce methane emission to the atmosphere, because they provide sites for methane oxidation, and they may also prevent methanogenesis. For floating plants, there is much less known, and this was one of the reasons why we were very interested in the effects of floating plants on methane emissions. And here I would like to show some of the work of Hernandez Oliveira Jr. that he did, focusing on water hyacinth in the Pantanal and in the Amazon. So here you see the different sites that he was working, and here you see the kind of environments that we were working. So what he did is he measured greenhouse gas emissions inside the plant bed and in the open water. So I placed it very near the plant beds here, but in reality we took a little bit further away. We measured the emissions, and what we found is that the greenhouse gas emission in the open water, so that's what we see here, was generally much higher than from the plant bed. And for the CO2, this might not be very surprising, because these plants, they grow very rapidly, so their photosynthetic rates, they are very high, so they can take up a lot of CO2. But also for the global warming potential, so this includes methane, we see that the methane emission in the open water is much higher than in the plant bed. So what is going on here? And of course, we also see that the difference between these two box plots is very limited. So CO2 is really driving the overall greenhouse gas emission here. But what we see is in general very high release of CO2 and methane from the open water. CO2 uptake from in the plant bed, and lower methane emission also from the plant bed. And this corresponds with also lower methane concentration in the rhizosphere as compared to the open water. So we think that there is really a very high methane oxidation going on these roots, and actually the experiments that we did with the roots and also looking at the microbial community present on these roots confirms this. We did not find a significant difference between abolition in the open water and in the plant bed, but we did some additional measures, removing the plants in the plant bed and also putting our funnels there. And then we found a very an apparent increase in abolition in the open spots as compared to the funnels in the plant beds that still had the rhizosphere below the funnel. So this is another indication that these bubbles are actually trapped in the rhizosphere. They're partially dissolve again and are being oxidized, thereby also reducing the methane methane emissions, from these plant beds. So in general, this methane emission of these plant beds was lower than in the open water. But zooming in, we saw that in some places there were very high increases actually in methane emissions from the plant beds. And we found that these were mostly in sites where the plant roots were reaching the sediment. So they're tapping into this methane-rich sediment, and then they act kind of as emergent plants, and they act as a chimney transporting the methane to the atmosphere. So there was really a very strong increase from free floating to rooted plants. Of course, still we see a very big variability in these things. So we were thinking there must be other factors that are also of important here. Besides the morphology and the direct morphology of the system that we're looking at, probably also the morphology of the plants may play an important role. And this was the work of Quinten Struik, who looked at different plant traits and how they mediated the methane emission through the plants. And I don't want to go too much in detail here because Quinten presented his work in session 6. So if you are interested, please have a look at his presentation. And then I would like to move on to yet another factor that is, of course, a very strong impact. In the previous talks, it was also mentioned fish and submerged macrophages. They are often very strong drivers of all kinds of biotic and abiotic processes going on in a lake. And we were also very interested in how fish would impact greenhouse gas emissions. And particularly also on their effect on abolition, because you can imagine that if you put a fish in an aquarium where bubbles have already been built up, they will disturb the sediment and thereby liberating these methane bubbles. And this is also what you see when you go out sampling, right? When you put your sediment core or your anchor into the sediment, you see this burst of bubbles coming up. However, with bioturbation, it's a little bit more complex, because if it happens at a more regular basis, you can also think that these bioturbators, they introduce a lot of oxygen or other terminal electron acceptors to the top sediment layer, thereby again preventing methane production and perhaps also facilitating methane oxidation. So it's a little bit more complex. You have these trophic and these non-trophic interactions going on in the sediment. So what we did is we designed an experiment in our experimental garden in Nijmegen, where we had either fish or no fish present. And here you see the funnels that were used to capture the bubbles. And there we indeed see that if we have benthic fish, the methane abolition was roughly 3 times lower than if we would have no fish. So we really found that benthivorous fish reduced methane abolition, and it also reduced methane diffusion, probably because there was less methane being produced in the sediment. Simultaneously, however, we also found that the CO2 emissions increased, likely to this higher aerobic decomposition, both in the water column, where organic matter was resuspended, and also in this aerated top sediment layer. So overall, in this case, we found a higher greenhouse gas emission from our fish ponds. So this made us very curious what is going on in this top layer of the sediment, but in these dark, larger systems, it was not so easy to observe. So we did another experiment, and I say we, but most of the work here was done by Maite Colina, who also was also giving a talk about a different project of her PhD, but still very really recommend to watch it. And we did some experiments with and without fish, and using also different species of fish to look at the effect of these fish on methane emissions. And there, indeed, we see that if the oxygen penetration depth, which we could really easily measure in these systems, if the oxygen penetration depth increases, we find less methane being emitted. And the opposite we found just as in the outdoor cosms for CO2. If we have more oxygen in the sediment, we find more CO2. The nice catch was, however, that these 4 centimeter penetration depth was not due to fish, but due to the tube effects that was present in the sediment that we used. So in these very low oxygen penetration depth, this is where the fish is. So in the beginning, they ate all the tube effects, and then they left the sediment a little bit alone. And in the controls where we had no fish, we had a lot of bioturbation, and quite deep bioturbation by tube effects. So we also see this very strong trophic effect of fish on greenhouse gas emissions here. And we also find some interesting non-trophic effects, but hopefully the paper will come out soon, and then you can read all about it. So then I would like to move to the topic also of the conference, and that's the importance of these inland waters with respect to carbon fluxes on the landscape scale. And for this, I hope you allow me to focus on ditches instead of on shallow lakes, because here we did a lot of work in ditches. Again, in the Netherlands, and for the people that do not know where it is, this is this small stamp is the Netherlands, and that's also where we produce this very famous Gouda cheese, which I will show you in a minute, has a very large carbon footprint, because they are produced in these regions that are have very organic soil. It's very wet, and that's why there are a lot of ditches to drain the land, so the cows can walk here, or the farmer can go there with heavy machinery to cut the grass and feed it to the cows that are indoors. So we know that this is emitting a lot of CO2 because we are draining organic soil, so oxygen is going into the peat, leading to peat oxidation, and this is causing a very strong soil subsidence. So the soil is going down, the sea level is going up, and this is of course a very unsustainable situation, as we are already below sea level. But so far nobody has really looked at, and I should rephrase, there are some studies already looking at the greenhouse gas emissions from these ditches, but these were mostly based on summer emissions and very local studies. So we wanted to look at year-round emissions of both abolition and diffusive fluxes. So this is a paper in preparation by Lisanne Hendricks et al. And we selected 10 different ditches varying in morphology and trophic state. So these are the random numbers referring to the ditches. And here we have the average emission of abolition, diffusive fluxes of methane and CO2 emissions. So first of all, we see, of course, that there is a very high variation in emission amongst these among these ditches. And we again see that abolition rules. It's very often the most important emission pathway. And what we also found is that our emission factors are roughly 2 to 5 times higher than the default values that are reported in the IPCC manual, let's say, to quantify greenhouse gas emissions from aquatic ecosystems. So these very hypertrophic ditches that we have, and because of the intensive agricultural use, really emit a lot of methane. And this is also a very important finding for our national reporting, because now, of course, we are reporting our anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And if I take the worst emission factor from these highly drained organic soils, our ditches are 2.5 times higher on average, again, than what we are using for this natural reporting. And this is important because sometimes, very often, 20% of the surface area is actually ditch. So I think we have to increase the number that we use here to estimate the emissions from these areas. So we know that now, and we're getting more and more insight in what is driving the variability in these in the emissions from these drivers. And I have to say that we found very fertile soil with the authorities working with these climate or water management in these systems. So we were particularly working together with the water authority around Amsterdam. And what they did, they were very interested in making an inventory of all their carbon emissions. So what they did is they estimated how much carbon they were emitting by oxidizing these agricultural peat meadows. And what they historically have been doing is they mostly focus on emission reduction efforts on this little piece of the pie, which is their wastewater treatment plants, their cars, isolating their offices, and making this pie chart with the water bodies here and the peat meadows there really, I think, was an eye-opener to realize that they should not only focus on this, but also on this, which is something that is very high on the political agenda in the Netherlands, I have to say also, not only because we want to reduce CO2 emissions, but also, as I just said, because we're drowning ourselves. But now there's also a very strong focus on trying to reduce the emissions from these heavily managed inland waters. And I think there is really some potential to do so. So several studies, for instance, based on the mesocosm experiments in Denmark and also in the UK, show us that the reduction of nutrient loading can be the way forward to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from inland waters. And these ditches are, of course, ideal sites where we potentially could realize this. I also believe, and we are looking more into that optimizing submerged macrophage growth would really reduce methane emissions from these ditches, minimizing floating plant coverage. But also these systems are very regularly dredged. So a climate smart way to dispose of this dredge would also be a big reduction factor. And of course, the reduction of organic matter loading to these systems could be a way forward. And this water authority is really interested in doing research together with us to see if we can really achieve this. And here I just said that there are several studies already showing that higher nutrient loading leads to higher emissions. So also vice versa, right? Lower nutrient loading would lead to lower emissions. And we also did an experiment with this, but then with much higher nutrient loadings than the conventional mesocosms do, because we really wanted to mimic these very hypertrophic ditches that we have. And we see the same pattern. More nutrients is more emissions. And I have to say that this, particularly at these very high nutrient loadings, we found a very high N2O emissions. So here N2O is a considerable part of the total greenhouse gas emissions that we found. So this was one part of our footprint, right? So the production of cheese and also powdered milk is really a big contributor of CO2 to the atmosphere. So we calculated that roughly 16% of all the methane from the Netherlands comes from these ditches, actually. And then I would like to move on to aquaculture. So this is a field we recently moved into. I am not an aquaculture specialist, but I think that all the experience that we obtained from working in more natural systems can contribute to understanding the budget of these ponds as well. So there was a recent global kind of meta-analysis by Juan et al., who calculated this 6 teragrams of methane per year that I showed you earlier. And this is based on all the papers available that he could find to get the best estimate of how much methane is being emitted from these ponds. And then when you dive a little bit into the methodology that these different papers used, which we did in this Stoughton paper, is that you find that most of these papers only use diffusive fluxes in their calculations. Also, they only use emissions that occurred mostly, I have to say, there were exceptions, but most of the papers only focus on the wet part of the production cycle, whereas these ponds are very often drained, and then also the sediment is removed. And as we have seen, this drying and re-wetting cycle may also lead to very strong boosts in emissions, which of course have to be included if you want to have the whole emission included. So as said, we already thought that abolition would also play a very important role here. And in Renske Vroom's talk in session 16, she will also show that for the first data that we have from a whole bunch of Brazilian fish ponds, we actually also confirm this, that yeah, this is definitely something that we have to move into, and this is also something we will start to do in the future. Not only because it's interesting to quantify, but also we want to understand what we can do to minimize these emissions, right? And here I just want to show you what the implications are, because you hear me talking about the importance of bubbles and the importance of assessing the whole life cycle, but what does this really do for the footprint of our food? So if we look at the footprint of fish, pork, and beef, we see that beef is by far the worst thing to eat from a climate perspective. It has a CO2 equivalent of roughly 140 kilograms per kilogram of protein. And fish cultured fish, that is believed to be very environmental friendly. It has a very low footprint when you look into the literature, but that is because they only include the carbon emissions related to, for example, feed production for the fish, transport of the fish to the market, and very infrastructure-like assessments are included here. But then if we would include the estimates of methane emission from the Juan et al. Paper, so again, this was mostly based on diffusive fluxes, we already come to a much higher footprint of the fish. So here we see the emission intensity of the fish, right? This corresponds with this one. Now we have already a much higher footprint, but then if we would also include the estimated abolitive flux, so I'm even not including the drought and the dredge disposal here, we come to a much higher footprint of cultured fish, and it's already approaching beef. So here you see that it's very good to, it's very important to get your numbers right, also to get a more informed decision on your diet. So I think what I would like for you to take home is that wow, these systems, the natural ones, but definitely also the human-made ones and the heavily managed ones, they have a very important role in the global carbon cycle, and I think there is a momentum to do something about it from a climate smart water management perspective. We are not yet there, but I think there is a momentum from a sustainability perspective. There are potentially large steps to be made. In some countries, coastal countries with organic soils, there's also this land subsidence momentum. We have to do something anyway, so we better do it as good as possible, taking all different aspects into consideration. But also from an ecological perspective, I think there is much to gain. You know, we have to, and we are actually also working very hard to improve the ecological status of our water bodies in Europe, for example, using the European Water Framework Directive. So we already want to reduce nutrient loading, reduce floating plants, and enhance submerged macrophyte growth, also to stimulate biodiversity and water quality. And this very likely, as all our evidence points towards, will also lead to lower greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a very nice win-win perspective. So as a conclusion and an outlook, as I have shown, there is still considerable uncertainty in the emission intensities from surface waters. So there is still much work to do, and that's also nice. These emissions are relevant on a landscape scale and a national scale. For instance, from our country, 16% of the methane seems to come from these ditches. But also on a global scale, both from natural systems, but also for these man-made systems directly related to food production. We are identifying different microbial and macrobiota drivers next to the more physical drivers, and climate smart water management can be a very promising tool from multiple perspectives. So this is something we are going to work on in the future. And of course, I said I don't do this alone. We have a lot of different knowledge institutes and universities collaborating, and also a lot of water authorities on local and national level, but also very importantly, different consultancy firms that actually want to use this knowledge so they can help others to apply it. So here I would like to end my talk. Obrigada pela sua atenção, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarian, for the excellent talk, an excellent take-home message. So we have some questions in the Q&A. The first one from Nestor Maceu. Sarian, good to see you again. Thanks for the excellent lecture. The data published by Oliveira Jr. et al. On the impact of ecornia on CO2 and methane emissions is very interesting. Totally considering with the special gradients that we have observed of partial pressure of CO2 in water in shallow systems with floating vegetation in the margins located in the Pantanal. Surviving more than 100 points in regular grid at noon. Un enorme abrazo.
Thank you, Nestor. It's very nice that our findings link so closely. I think I have seen this paper, but I'm not sure if to which one you are referring, but we should talk about this at some point. Nice.
So now we have a question from Andrea Bertolo. Thanks for the very interesting talk. I have a naive question. I was wondering if there might be any potential positive effect to floating plants related to their methane bubble trap effect in terms. Oh, sorry. I lost here because I have a lot of questions. So, I was wondering if there might be any potential positive effect to floating plants related to their methane bubble trap effects in terms of uptake, or is this more likely to be not relevant for the plant itself?
Okay, I am not 100% sure if I understand the question correctly, but I see two ways of answering it. For one, I am very much aware that I gave kind of two different messages about the impact of floating plants, because what we saw mostly in the Pantanal is that these plants are reducing the methane emissions, whereas in our ditches we very much see that they very often increase methane emissions, and I believe that is because in the Pantanal waters, very often the oxygen concentration is already very low, so the plants do not reduce the oxygen below that much, thereby not stimulating methane so much, because it's also already being produced in the open water a lot. And this bubble trap effect, I am not sure if the plants will have a lot of positive effects by that directly. What we have seen is that some plants, they have symbiosis with methane oxidation bacteria, and they actually get a lot of their carbon from methane oxidizers that are present in their tissues. But this is mostly in sites with sphagnum that are partially submerged, where CO2 is very limiting. I think in these big plants that can capture a lot of CO2, this bypass via methane will be not that big, but stable isotope presence would I know there is some work in the Pantanal also stable isotope composition of plants does show a little bit of impact of this methane. So I don't think it's a big role, but it could be a partial pathway.
Okay. Another question from Cielio Amorim. Hello, Sarian. Thanks for your inspiring talk. Congratulations on all your papers, especially those developed in Brazil. Do you have an idea on what is the most important source of greenhouse gases in aquatic systems? Drought, eutrophation, climate change, fishing, hydropower plants, etc. Are emissions in aquatic ecosystems higher than in terrestrial habitats?
Yeah, so to start with the last question, which is the easiest one, is that what we see is that a lot of dry areas or drier areas that are oxygenated, at least the top layer of the soil, they are very often methane sinks. So the bacteria living there are actually using methane also from the atmosphere. So in this sense, yes, aquatic systems are much more important when it comes to methane emissions than terrestrial habitats. And then the first question, which systems are most important? Yeah, that is a very complex question to answer, I think. Of course, we have very beautiful natural systems that are emitting methane, but this is you could say like part of our natural global cycle. But then when you look at this booming and expanding aquatic areas related to rice culture and fish ponds, and also hydropower plants, I think these are really anthropogenic emissions. So I would argue that those are the most important ones to tackle.
Okay. Another question by Aliger. Thanks for a great talk, Sarian. So what would you suggest the ditch farmers should do minimize methane emissions? And is there a way out?
Yeah, so that's also a very interesting question, and that's something we really want to work on in the nearby future, because the most straightforward thing would be, okay, if we let them terrestrialize, because these systems will terrestrialize if we don't dredge them regularly, we would have a nice carbon sink, and eventually you would have a wetland that you would think would at least balance out when it comes to methane outgassing and CO2 uptake, because we would have growing peat. But politically, this is not, we are not ready for that. So we are now trying to find some midway where farmers can still farm, and we can minimize these emissions. So what we're looking at is kind of an end of pipe solution here, trying to work with border buffer zones, for instance, minimizing organic carbon coming in, because there's a lot of erosion in these systems, even though they're very flat, and also trying to reduce nutrient loading to these ditches, which is of course not easy, because it's something we have been talking about for a long time from a biodiversity perspective as well. But I think we can make steps here, tackling the dredge and also trying to get our submerged macrophages back. But it's the ideal situation is not reachable yet, I would say.
Okay, Sarian, another one from Noor Phyllis. Thank you, Sarian, for the great talk. Regarding to comparison of open water and littoral zone with plants, I wondered if you compared open water with littoral zone without plants or with reeds, how reed beds affected?
Okay, so I think this refers to the work we did in the Amazon and the Pantanal. So here we really specifically focused on Eichhornia, so the water hyacinth. So here we did not include the littoral zone with reeds, which I agree definitely will give a completely different signal, possibly with much higher methane emissions because of this chimney effect that I mentioned before. But I think it is something we really need to include in our ditch work as well, when thinking about these buffer zones, for instance. These buffer zones that we would think of creating to reduce nutrient loading and organic matter loading to the sediments may become hotspots of methane emissions then. And that is, now we would be like trying to get the water away with the tap open, right? So this is really something we have to be very careful with, and of course include if we want to have the whole system analysis.
Now from Raquel Mendonça. Thank you, Sarian, for this beautiful and inspiring talk. I have two questions. First, how would you expect aquatic plants to affect the carbon sequestration in freshwater systems? Second one, the proliferation of floating plants is a big problem for the functioning of hydropower reservoirs in Brazil. And we know that the reservoirs are a huge source of methane emissions to the atmosphere. Do you see a way of taking advantage of the floating plants and managing them so as to mitigate part of the methane emission from reservoirs?
Thanks, Raquel, for the questions. To the first question, so how would I expect aquatic plants to affect carbon sequestration in freshwater systems? Yeah, that is a very, I think, a very relevant question, because as I said, they take up a lot of CO2, and part of this of the organic matter, when they decay again, will be transferred or mineralized into methane. This does not have to be a bad thing as long as there are more carbon being sequestered than emitted. And this, I think this is really depends on the system again. So in these riverine systems, we did not find a lot of carbon sequestration. So the sediment layer is very thin. So there was not a lot of sequestration going on, but we have no idea how it is downstream, because many of these plants, they actually float away when the water rises. So there might be very rich carbon burial spots that we are missing in this assessment. So maybe that's a good idea for us to follow the plants someday in a boat and then see where they'll end up. If they go all the way to the ocean and they mineralize there, yeah, then it may not be such of a big effect. But if you have a more closed system and there's a lot of carbon being buried, this of course may offset the methane that they also produce. And then the second question, yeah, so could we profit from the floating plants? I think that there are some companies already, right, that are taking out the water hyacinth, also in Asia, and there are these biodigesters being built specifically also for Egonia. So you have to have the infrastructure, but if you can digest them and have the methane being produced under controlled conditions, and you can actually capture the methane, of course, then you have a fuel source. I don't know the details of this, but I know that these systems are being used in different parts of the world. So this may be a very nice way forward, and it may also be a way of taking away nutrients from eutrophied systems.
Okay, move on. Question from Luke Demester. Hi, Sarian. Thanks for the superb talk and highly important work. You refer to win-win in terms of water management, and I would agree, of course, but I can imagine that at a broader scale, one might have arguments to reduce the surface area of wetlands, which would be devastating from a biodiversity point of view. What is your view on the total picture of ecosystem service of wetlands when taking these greenhouse gas emissions into account?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Luke, for this question. Yeah, I think it's very complicated, and of course, I'm not talking about draining natural wetlands here, because that would definitely not be my intention. But what we actually see is an expansion of wetlands, but then very monotonic wetlands, like the ones for rice culture or for fish aquaculture. These were not there yet, and of course they could also play a role in biodiversity and in these stepping stones that we have seen before. But in this respect, I sometimes feel a little bit with the potato farmers arguing that their production of potatoes is much more greenhouse gas friendly than the rice culture. So I think in this respect, also the dry rice culture, for example, I don't think we can move towards dry fish culture. But these new and very artificial wetlands, those would be the ones that I would tackle first. I hope that answers your question.
So this is from Alice Dalla Vecchia. Thank you, Sarian, for the very interesting lecture. When you said that the real CO2 emission related to fish is much higher than considered so far, do you know if the same can be said for other animals rated for meat, such as beef or pork?
Yeah, so I don't know. I did not look too deep into how the carbon footprint assessment was done for beef and pork. I kind of took those for granted, I have to admit. But I can imagine that these assessments have been done for a longer period of time again. So I assume they are more complete. But you're absolutely right. There could be a very big uncertainty range around those assessments as well. So I don't know. I invite you to dive into that and then come back to me and tell me what you think.
Okay, we move on from Pablo Urrutia Cordeiro. Thank you, Sarian. I learned a lot. Unfortunately, I could not attend all the talk and not sure if you mentioning this. When it comes to designing water body, what do you think about trade-offs in terms of multiple ecosystem service? Can we design wetlands to emit low greenhouse gases without compromising other aspects like water quality, biodiversity? Are there studies on whether this can occur?
Thank you, Pablo, for this interesting question as well. And we are, I think we are at the beginning of understanding how this can be done. So one of the alternatives for these peatlands that we are considering, at least in the Netherlands, is this palidiculture. So this is wet agriculture, because now we are oxidizing all these peat. And the idea is if we can really have wet crops, this may offset the very high CO2 emissions that we have there now. Of course, if we do this, we also find that we are, if we do this without any concern about the history of these places, we are boosting methane emissions. So what the first evidence is pointing towards is that by, for example, removing this very rich top layer that has been previously exposed to oxygen and has a lot of phosphate because of previous agricultural practices, could really balance off these high methane emissions, especially that are occurring initially. So what we have been doing, for example, is removing this top, and I say we, but these are actually my direct colleagues, removing these top layer and using them to for example, build dikes around houses. That is definitely needed, and then flood these systems. And then because of this very high primary production that we have there, and the nice water quality, because we removed most of the phosphate, yeah, we can set off these high methane emissions by the high primary production there. So I think we are moving in that direction.
Okay, we have a lot of questions yet, but I have to do the last one because we have to move on to the thematic sessions. Okay, Sarian. So I from Evaldo Leitão, thanks for the excellent talk. I was wondering, what do we know about the contribution of organic matter from post-algal bloom to methane production?
So we know that the dying algae are very good. They are they're mostly very labile organic matter, so there can be if they decompose anaerobically, yes, we know that they are producing methane. In how much they contribute to the overall methane emission, of course, is a matter of balance. It also depends on how much organic matter is coming in from outside. But yes, this definitely is an internal organic carbon producing flux. So they are definitely important.
Okay, have a very nice questions, but unfortunately we don't have time. I would like to pass to José Ataíde.